Imagine risking your life for something you can buy today for less than the price of a cup of coffee. In 1498, after nearly a year at sea, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama finally reached the southwest coast of India. His crew had endured violent storms, starvation, disease, and months without seeing land. Nearly a third of his men never made it. When the local ruler asked why he had traveled over 17,000 miles across one of the world's most dangerous oceans, his answer was surprisingly simple. He wanted pepper. Not gold, not jewels, not silk, just pepper, along with cinnamon and cloves. Today, those spices sit quietly on supermarket shelves, forgotten beside ordinary salt and sugar. But 500 years ago, they were among the most valuable commodities on earth. Entire kingdoms measured their wealth in sacks of pepper. Merchants crossed continents to acquire cinnamon. Kings negotiated treaties over cloves, and armies marched to control tiny islands where nutmeg trees happened to grow. History often tells us that empires were built for land, religion, or precious metals. Those certainly played their part. Yet behind many of the world's greatest voyages, colonial conquests, and financial revolutions stood something far less obvious: a handful of dried seeds, bark, berries, and flower buds. The global race for spices launched the age of exploration, created some of history's first multinational corporations, reshaped international trade, and changed the political map of the world forever. Millions of people would be displaced, enslaved, or killed because of products most of us casually sprinkle onto dinner without a second thought. But how did ordinary plants become powerful enough to reshape civilization? To answer that question, we have to travel back thousands of years, long before European explorers crossed the oceans, to the fertile banks of the Nile, where spices were already considered sacred, and where one of history's greatest trading networks quietly began. Long before Rome became an empire, before the Silk Road connected east and west, and even before the pyramids had fully weathered beneath the Egyptian sun, spices were already traveling astonishing distances. Around 1500 BCE, priests in ancient Egypt used cinnamon, cassia, and myrrh during the sacred process of mummification. These fragrant materials were packed around the bodies of kings and nobles, burned inside temples, and offered to the gods. To the Egyptians, spices were not simply pleasant aromas. They were symbols of purity, preservation, and eternal life. But there was one extraordinary problem. None of these spices grew anywhere near Egypt. True cinnamon came from Sri Lanka. Black pepper thrived along India's Malabar coast. Cloves originated thousands of miles farther east on a handful of volcanic islands in present-day Indonesia. Every stick of cinnamon or pouch of pepper that reached the Nile had already crossed jungles, mountains, deserts, and oceans before arriving in Egyptian hands. Someone had built an international trading system thousands of years before the word globalization even existed. Merchants sailed across the Arabian Sea, crossed the Red Sea, loaded caravans with precious cargo, and guided camels through scorching deserts toward the Mediterranean. Every stop increased both the distance and the price. Each trader added another layer of profit before the spices finally reached wealthy buyers. What made this remarkable was not only the logistics but the secrecy. Few people knew exactly where these spices came from. Most buyers only understood that they arrived from mysterious lands far beyond the horizon, making them seem almost magical. That mystery became part of their value. The rarer the origin appeared, the more desirable the spice became. By the time a handful of cinnamon reached an Egyptian temple, it represented months of dangerous travel and the combined efforts of countless merchants scattered across continents. Without realizing it, these ancient traders had created one of humanity's first truly international supply chains, one that would continue shaping history for thousands of years, eventually becoming so profitable that entire civilizations would compete to control it. As the Egyptian kingdoms faded and the Roman Empire rose, spices transformed from sacred offerings into one of the most profitable commodities on earth. Among them, one stood above all the rest: black pepper. Today it sits unnoticed beside the salt shaker, but in ancient Rome it was treated almost like currency. Wealthy families displayed it at banquets to impress their guests. Merchants stored it in locked warehouses. Landlords accepted it as payment, and valuable contracts could be settled with sacks of pepper instead of silver. The Romans simply couldn't get enough of it. Ships sailed from India's Malabar coast, carrying pepper toward Arabian ports. From there, camel caravans crossed harsh deserts before reaching Alexandria, where Roman merchants eagerly purchased every shipment they could find. By the time the pepper finally arrived in Rome, its price had multiplied many times over. Yet demand only continued to grow. The Roman scholar Pliny the Elder watched this obsession with increasing frustration. Writing in the 1st century AD, he questioned why Rome was sending enormous amounts of silver eastward every year in exchange for products that, in his eyes, merely changed the taste of food. His concern wasn't entirely unfounded. Archaeologists have discovered thousands of Roman coins buried across southern India and Sri Lanka, silent evidence of a massive trade imbalance. Precious metals flowed east, while spices flowed west. The value of pepper became so extraordinary that even invading armies recognized its worth. When the Visigoths surrounded Rome in 410 AD, their leader demanded not only gold and silver as ransom, but thousands of pounds of black pepper. That single request revealed something remarkable. Pepper had become more than a seasoning. It had become portable wealth. It was durable, easy to transport, universally desired, and valuable almost everywhere it traveled. In many ways, it functioned like an international currency, centuries before paper money or modern banking connected distant civilizations. As Europe's appetite for spices continued to grow, those who controlled the routes between Asia and Europe discovered that they possessed something even more valuable than the spices themselves. They controlled access, and that monopoly would soon make a handful of merchants richer than kings. As demand for spices exploded across Europe, another group quietly became even wealthier than the people growing them. They never planted a single pepper vine. They rarely harvested a cinnamon tree. Yet for more than 1,000 years, they controlled one of the richest trading systems in history. These were the Arab merchants. Stretching from the ports of southern Arabia to the bustling markets of Alexandria, they occupied the critical middle link between Asia's spice-producing regions and Europe's hungry consumers. Every sack of pepper, every bundle of cinnamon, every precious clove passed through their hands before reaching the Mediterranean. Their greatest advantage wasn't military power, it was information. Arab sailors possessed detailed knowledge of the Indian Ocean's monsoon winds, seasonal air currents that allowed ships to sail safely between East Africa, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia. Sail at the wrong time of year, and a voyage could end in disaster. Sail with the winds, and entire fleets could cross oceans with remarkable efficiency. This knowledge was worth a fortune, so they protected it fiercely. Even more ingenious was the way they concealed the true origins of spices. Rather than reveal where cinnamon or cloves actually grew, merchants invented elaborate legends that fascinated European buyers. One popular story claimed cinnamon sticks were gathered from the nests of enormous birds perched on impossible cliffs. Traders supposedly placed large pieces of meat below the nests, causing the birds to carry them upward. The nests would collapse under the weight, allowing the precious cinnamon to fall safely to the ground. It sounded unbelievable. But for centuries, Europeans believed it. After all, almost no one in Europe had ever seen a cinnamon tree. The less people knew, the easier it became to maintain the monopoly. Meanwhile, Alexandria flourished as the world's greatest spice market. Cargo from India arrived through the Red Sea before crossing the Egyptian desert by camel caravan. There, merchants from across the Mediterranean competed fiercely for limited supplies, driving prices ever higher. By the time pepper reached a dinner table in Paris or Venice, dozens of traders had already profited from the same handful of berries. Europe desperately wanted spices, but someone else controlled the door. Eventually, European rulers stopped asking how much spices cost. They began asking a far more dangerous question. What if we eliminated the middlemen altogether? By the Middle Ages, Europe's fascination with spices had grown into something far greater than a taste for exotic food. It had become an obsession. Walk into the kitchen of a wealthy noble in London, Paris, or Venice, and nearly every meal would contain pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, or mace. Meat was seasoned repeatedly. Wine was infused with fragrant spices. Sweet desserts and savory dishes often used the very same ingredients. To modern tastes, many of these recipes would seem overwhelming. But in medieval Europe, the stronger the spices, the greater the display of wealth. Serving heavily spiced food wasn't simply about flavor. It was a public declaration that you could afford ingredients imported from the opposite side of the world. The obsession extended far beyond the dining table. Doctors prescribed spices for almost every imaginable illness. Ginger was believed to calm the stomach. Cloves were recommended for toothaches. Cinnamon supposedly treated fevers, while nutmeg was thought to improve digestion, memory, and even sleep. Although modern medicine has confirmed only some of these benefits, medieval physicians sincerely believed spices possessed extraordinary healing powers. Religion added another layer of demand. Churches burned aromatic resins during ceremonies. Wealthy families purchased expensive spices for religious festivals and important celebrations. The sweet fragrance of imported spices became closely associated with purity, luxury, and divine favor. Naturally, wherever enormous demand exists, enormous profits follow. No European city understood this better than Venice. Thanks to exclusive agreements with Arab merchants, Venetian traders controlled much of Europe's spice supply. Their warehouses overflowed with pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and ginger arriving from Alexandria before being distributed across the continent. Every sack that passed through Venice generated another fortune. The city's magnificent palaces, glittering churches, and powerful merchant fleets were financed, in large part, by the spice trade. Venetian merchants became some of the richest businessmen in Europe, while rival kingdoms watched helplessly as prices continued to climb. Then, almost overnight, everything changed. In 1453, Constantinople, the great gateway between Europe and Asia, fell to the Ottoman Empire. Trade routes didn't disappear. They became far more expensive. Taxes increased. Prices soared. Pepper became a luxury few could comfortably afford, while cinnamon and cloves reached record values. Europe faced an uncomfortable reality. As long as someone else controlled the route to Asia, someone else would control Europe's wealth. The only solution was no longer to buy spices. It was to find a completely new way to reach them. By the late 15th century, Europe had reached a breaking point. Demand for spices had never been higher, yet the cost of obtaining them kept rising. Every shipment passed through layers of merchants, taxes, and political rivalries before finally reaching European markets. Kings watched enormous amounts of gold and silver leave their kingdoms, enriching distant trading powers instead. They wanted a shortcut. One small kingdom believed it could find one: Portugal. Unlike Venice, Portugal had little access to the lucrative Mediterranean trade routes. If it wanted a share of the spice trade, it needed an entirely different strategy. Rather than competing with established merchants, Portuguese rulers decided to bypass them altogether. Their plan was breathtakingly ambitious: sail around Africa and reach India directly. For decades, Portuguese captains cautiously explored farther down Africa's western coastline. Each expedition pushed a little farther than the last, mapping unfamiliar waters, discovering new harbors, and learning how to survive on increasingly dangerous voyages. Progress was painfully slow. Ships disappeared without warning. Crews died from disease, starvation, and violent storms. Many expeditions returned with little more than new coastlines drawn onto maps. Then, in 1488, everything changed. Bartolomeu Dias successfully rounded the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope. For the first time, Europeans knew the Indian Ocean could be reached entirely by sea. The impossible suddenly became possible. Just 4 years later, another explorer attempted a completely different solution. Christopher Columbus believed sailing west across the Atlantic would provide an even faster route to Asia's legendary spice markets. He wasn't searching for a new continent. He expected to arrive in India, purchase pepper and cinnamon, and return home with unimaginable profits. Instead, he found the Americas. He spent months searching for the spices he believed had to be nearby, never realizing he had reached an entirely different world. Columbus died convinced he had discovered the edge of Asia. While Spain celebrated its unexpected discovery, Portugal remained focused on its original mission. In 1498, Vasco da Gama finally completed the journey around Africa and reached India. After centuries of relying on middlemen, Europe had found its own direct path to the spice trade. But opening the route was only the beginning. The real struggle would be deciding who controlled it and how far they were willing to go to keep it. Vasco da Gama returned to Portugal as a national hero. Although his first expedition brought back only a modest cargo of pepper and cinnamon, the profits were astonishing. The spices sold in Europe for nearly 60 times the cost of the voyage itself. Few investments in history had ever produced returns like that. For the Portuguese crown, the conclusion was obvious. If one ship could generate such wealth, an entire fleet could build an empire. Within just a few years, Portuguese vessels began arriving in the Indian Ocean in increasing numbers. But unlike the Arab, Indian, Chinese, and Malay merchants who had traded together for centuries, Portugal had little interest in joining the existing commercial network. It wanted to dominate it. The Indian Ocean had long functioned as an open marketplace. Ships from different cultures exchanged goods in busy ports, stretching from East Africa to Southeast Asia. Competition certainly existed, but trade was generally based on negotiation rather than conquest. The Portuguese introduced something entirely different: cannons. Their heavily armed warships possessed firepower unlike anything local merchant fleets had encountered. Ports that refused Portuguese demands were bombarded. Merchant ships were seized. Rivals were forced to accept Portuguese authority or face destruction. Soon, strategic ports fell one after another. Goa became Portugal's headquarters in India. Malacca gave them control over one of the world's busiest maritime choke points, where nearly every ship traveling between the Indian Ocean and East Asia had to pass. From there, Portuguese fleets pushed deeper into Southeast Asia until they finally reached the legendary Spice Islands themselves. Control no longer depended on better prices. It depended on military power. The Portuguese introduced a licensing system requiring merchant ships to purchase official permits before sailing through waters they had freely navigated for generations. Vessels without Portuguese approval risked confiscation, or worse. Trade had become taxation. Taxation became coercion. Coercion became empire. What had once been a commercial competition for pepper and cinnamon was rapidly transforming into a struggle for global dominance. Yet despite its spectacular victories, Portugal faced one serious weakness. It was a small nation trying to control an ocean that stretched across thousands of miles. And somewhere in northern Europe, a new rival was preparing to build an empire, unlike anything the world had ever seen. Not a kingdom ruled by a king, but a corporation ruled by investors. By the end of the 16th century, Portugal's grip on the spice trade was beginning to weaken. Its empire stretched from East Africa to Southeast Asia, but maintaining such a vast network required more ships, more soldiers, and more money than a small nation could provide. Corruption spread through colonial administrations, defenses weakened, and rivals watched closely for an opportunity. The Dutch saw one. In 1602, the Dutch Republic created an organization unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. It was called the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC. On paper, it was a trading company. In reality, it functioned like a sovereign state. The VOC could recruit armies, build fortresses, negotiate treaties, mint coins, wage wars, and establish colonies, all while raising money from private investors. Ordinary citizens could purchase shares and profit from overseas trade, making the VOC the world's first publicly traded corporation. Its true target was simple: control the source of the spices. Unlike Portugal, which focused mainly on strategic ports, the Dutch aimed directly at the islands where spices actually grew. That goal led them to one of the smallest yet most valuable places on Earth, the Banda Islands. These tiny volcanic islands in present-day Indonesia were the world's only natural source of nutmeg and mace. Whoever controlled Banda controlled the global nutmeg market. The local Bandanese had traded freely with merchants from many nations for centuries. They welcomed competition because it kept prices high. The VOC wanted the exact opposite. It demanded an exclusive monopoly. When the islanders refused, the Dutch answered with overwhelming force. In 1621, Dutch troops invaded the Banda Islands. Thousands of inhabitants were killed, enslaved, or forced into exile. Survivors were replaced with enslaved laborers working on plantations owned by the company. An entire society was destroyed, not for gold or silver, but for a spice. The violence did not end there. To keep prices artificially high, the VOC destroyed nutmeg trees growing outside its control, and even burned excess harvests rather than allow supply to increase. Scarcity wasn't an accident. It became corporate policy. For decades, the world's most powerful company manipulated global markets, using methods that would still feel familiar today. And in one of history's most astonishing decisions, the Dutch would soon trade a remote colony in North America, later known as Manhattan, for the right to keep a tiny island covered with nutmeg trees. For nearly 2 centuries, the Dutch East India Company seemed unstoppable. Its ships dominated the seas. Its warehouses overflowed with pepper, cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg. Investors grew wealthy, and European markets depended on a supply chain controlled by a single corporation. But every monopoly contains the seeds of its own downfall. The more tightly the Dutch controlled spices, the more determined other nations became to break their grip. The greatest weapon against the VOC wasn't a larger navy, it was a single living plant. European botanists, merchants, and colonial officials began secretly collecting seeds and young spice trees. Smuggling became a form of economic warfare. French agents managed to transport clove seedlings out of Dutch-controlled territory and successfully planted them in islands across the Indian Ocean. The British followed with nutmeg. Soon, nutmeg trees were growing far beyond the Banda Islands, in Grenada, Singapore, Penang, and other tropical colonies. Pepper spread into Southeast Asia, Africa, and eventually South America. For the first time in centuries, spices were no longer confined to a handful of islands. The monopoly collapsed. As production increased, prices inevitably fell. A spice that had once been worth more than gold slowly became affordable for ordinary families. Technology accelerated the decline. Steamships dramatically shortened voyages that had once taken months. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 connected Europe and Asia faster than ever before. Refrigeration reduced the need to preserve food with heavy amounts of spices, removing one of the oldest reasons for their extraordinary value. One by one, the great spice empires disappeared. The VOC went bankrupt after decades of corruption and financial strain. Portugal's overseas dominance faded. Even the British East India Company, which had grown into one of history's largest commercial enterprises, eventually lost its political power. Every empire built primarily upon spices eventually fell. Ironically, the same global trade networks created to protect these monopolies ultimately destroyed them. When spices could be grown almost anywhere in the tropics, no single nation could control the world's supply. The age of spice empires had finally come to an end. But while the monopolies disappeared, their influence on history never did. The modern world still carries the fingerprints of the spice trade, in its borders, economies, corporations, and even the food on our tables today. Today, spices seem almost ordinary. A jar of black pepper costs only a few dollars. Cinnamon fills supermarket shelves year-round. Nutmeg appears in holiday desserts, and cloves quietly flavor baked goods and warm drinks. Few people stop to wonder why these simple ingredients are available almost everywhere. Yet behind every pinch of spice lies one of the most remarkable stories in human history. The roots first carved across the Indian Ocean by Arab sailors eventually became the same sea lanes used by modern cargo ships, carrying millions of containers every year. Port cities such as Goa, Malacca, and Zanzibar grew into cultural crossroads because merchants, sailors, and travelers from dozens of civilizations met there long before globalization became a modern idea. The spice trade also transformed finance. The Dutch East India Company introduced concepts that still shape today's economy: publicly traded shares, large-scale corporate investment, limited liability, and organized stock exchanges. Modern multinational corporations owe more to the spice trade than most people realize. But its darker legacy is impossible to ignore. The plantation systems developed to maximize spice production became models for later colonial economies built on sugar, cotton, coffee, and rubber. Land was seized, communities were displaced. Enslaved labor became a foundation of immense wealth that flowed into European capitals, while the producing regions paid the human cost. Many of those historical inequalities can still be traced today. Perhaps the greatest irony is how completely the meaning of spices has changed. For thousands of years, pepper represented wealth. Cinnamon symbolized prestige. Nutmeg inspired wars. Cloves financed corporations powerful enough to rival entire kingdoms. Now they are simply ingredients. The scarcity disappeared, but the world they created remained. National borders, international shipping routes, global corporations, financial markets, and even the blending of cuisines across continents all carry echoes of the ancient spice trade. The next time you season a meal with black pepper or stir cinnamon into a cup of coffee, remember that these ordinary flavors were once powerful enough to launch expeditions across unknown oceans, inspire empires to conquer distant lands, and reshape the course of world history. It turns out the story of spices was never really about food. It was always about power. And few things have changed the world more profoundly than humanity's endless desire to possess what seemed rare, valuable, and just beyond reach.